Amazon founder Jeff Bezos sent a thunderbolt through the media world this week with a surprise purchase of the Washington Post. We've got an expert panel here to weigh in on what it means for that world and what Bezos may do with the Post. First, ABC chief business correspondent Rebecca Jarvis has some background on the buy.
The paper that brought down Nixon and has been breaking news for more than a century, this week made news. After 80 years, the Graham family sold the Washington Post for $250 million to Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos.
We will become a place that does its traditional job, but tries things, and I hope a lot of them will succeed.
It won't be easy. Sales and profits both are shrinking, with circulation down nearly 40% in the last decade. Bezos told employees in order to turn it around, we will need to experiment. Which is exactly how Amazon got started. Today, it's worth more than $130 billion, surpassing expectations, as he told Nightline co-anchor Cynthia McFadden in 2009.
Did you have any idea how it was going to work?
No. The business plan was very modest compared to what happened.
Bezos isn't alone. Other billionaires have jumped into the print business. So what does Bezos do next? It's innovate or die.
It's dangerous not to evolve. If you want to ensure your extinction, cease to evolve.
For this week, Rebecca Jarvis, ABC News, New York.
Joined again by George Will. Your column's been in the Washington Post, 40 years? Yes. David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, also a longtime Washington Post reporter for about 10 years. Cory Johnson, Bloomberg, anchor of Bloomberg TV's Bloomberg West. I know you've covered Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And Arianna Huffington, editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post media group, stalwart in the new media. And actually, I guess your selling price was higher than the Washington Post just a couple of years ago.
Yes, it's interesting how everything has changed, but also it's interesting how much faster you can create a brand now. Obviously, the Washington Post is a historic, legendary media brand. But look at brands that were created, in the last few years. Twitter, 2006, Instagram, 2010, Huffington Post, 2005. So that changes dramatically the media landscape. But I think this is wonderful news.
And everything that Arianna just mentioned, George Will, I believe, you can add Tumblr, Instagram, anything else. They all went for higher prices than the Washington Post.
Yes, the Boston Globe was bought by the New York Times for $1.1 billion in 1993 and sold last week for $70 million. And the Times just gave it away, in fact. Mr. Bezos has earned a place in the pantheon of American business with Ford, Sloan, Jobs, Gates, Montgomery Ward, Sears and Roebuck, all of those. But he's a genius. He may not be a magician, and that's what we're going to find out.
Will it take a magician? I guess that's the question.
I think what he bought it for, George, I think his motives are unclear. He hasn't spoken. I think it's the sheer intellectual challenge of it, and it's a big one.
It certainly is a big one. I want to get to that question as well. But first, David, I want to talk to you about Donald Graham, the Graham family, one of the old media families. They loved the Washington Post, clearly didn't want to let it go. You wrote about his final speech to the Post and said this was kind of a tragedy.
Yeah, I think his heart was broken to have to give it up. But the Post was diminishing year by year. It was losing money. It was losing circulation. It was losing, and there was no answer. There was no answer.
Was it avoidable or not?
Well, I think even if he had made some different moves, made the paper more national than local, if he had embraced Politico in some way and made it his own, I don't know. I don't know if that would have saved it. Remember, New York is very different from Washington. The New York Times is very different from the Washington Post. And the New York Times has enough challenges as it is. Here's what interests me most, though. Jeff Bezos is a great innovator in technology. That's terrific. He has vastly more money than the Grahams, which is very important to invest in the newspaper. But will he run a newspaper that puts pressure on power? That's what should interest us most. And that's not a value that's a universal among anyone, much less the titans.
In fact, some have suggested the opposite, that perhaps he's buying the Washington Post to buy some sort of protection for his business. But let's bring this question to Cory Johnson. You've covered Jeff Bezos. You've covered Amazon. Talk a little bit about what his motives might be. George Will says it's the intellectual challenge.
When you talk to people who know Jeff Bezos, the first thing out of everyone's mouth is he's smart. And it's just interesting in a world of smart people, of hedge fund managers, of entrepreneurs in technology. He's the guy they say is smart, and he's quick and he's thoughtful. But one of the things that's interesting about Jeff Bezos is that he built his business initially on books. Of all the things he could have sold in the internet, he did in fact choose books. He chose Seattle because there was a distributor up there that would help him take on the likes of Barnes & Noble when it seemed ridiculous. Now we see Barnes & Noble, Borders and so on struggling so. And similarly, he really has a love of the written word. One of the interesting anecdotes I've picked up in the last year is from some former executives and even board members. He starts every meeting with study hall. So if you're an executive, you've got a big new project you want to bring them, you want to launch a multi-billion-dollar business, you bring your plan to the corporate meeting or to the board meeting, single-spaced, no graphics, no PowerPoint slides. Everyone sits and reads a multi-page memo in silence and then discusses this. He really loves the written word. He really loves the language. And I think that's an interesting thing.
That is fascinating.
Thing that tells us about the Washington Post.
But if you bring that together with the fact that he's a distribution master, somebody who can actually come up with different distribution channels for great journalism, and to David's point, somebody who really can use the internet to keep the feet of the powerful to the fire more effectively, because the internet allows you to do that constantly,
but one of the ways the internet is doing it, and those who have succeeded in the new media tend to have, George Will, a more clear ideological bent. Arianna Huffington's Huffington Post, for example. We've seen others on the right, and even the billionaires who've bought big newspapers seem to succeed when they have that kind of more political agenda rather than just a general agenda.
To the extent that we know what Mr. Bezos' political philosophy is, it's a kind of techie libertarianism. He's for gay marriage. He's against excessive taxation on people like him, which is perfectly sensible from my point of view. So in that point of view, it seems to me his ideology is less important to his motives than, again, the challenge of seeing if he can make this go.
Well, he's also pursued.
What Gutenberg started with the printed word half a millennium ago is not over because of the digital.
Well, indeed, it's changing dramatically right now.
It also could be incredibly important if he can establish a kind of beyond left and right position for the Washington Post. I mean, just look at all the things we're not covering at the moment because they're divided in this obsolete left-right way. The war on drugs. I mean, today, a big story in the New York Times about what's happening to the California prison system. I mean, we're having a major incarceration, drug war crisis. Somebody with his libertarian bent.
We know about them because we are covering these things, and one of the very few places that invests in it, that puts in the investment, is a place like the Washington Post or the New York Times, or I should say the New Yorker as well. Now, Mike Bloomberg is a great innovator, but I have to say I've heard straight from the horse's mouth from Mayor Bloomberg that he detests the New York Times.
Does that mean he doesn't want to buy it, or does he want to buy it and change it?
Well, he might want to do the latter, but it's not up for sale, by the way, as the Sulzbergers have made very clear for the moment. But Mike Bloomberg thinks the New York Times is an opinion page on the front page, and he really loathes it. Now, that may be the function of being covered day after day and having an ego the size.
I wouldn't imagine New York mayor has ever thought differently.
Well, but no New York mayor was ever the richest man in New York either, in the capacity to buy the New York Times. Again, he's done some astonishing things in the media, but being a newspaper proprietor like Donald Graham, like the Sulzbergers, is the exception. So Jeff Bezos may, in fact, be a wizard in many ways, but it remains to be seen if he has the same values as the Grahams. And if you trust Don Graham, as I learned to at 10 years of the Washington Post, I've never had to trust him more than in his judgment that he's going to revive the Washington Post.
Let me go to Cory with this, though.
Just one quick thing about that, because it's not just about strengthening journalism. It's also about looking at news and seeing how can we reinvent it, how can we redefine it, to move beyond simply covering what is corrupt and broken, to cover what is working, which is something with his foundation. He's done an amazing job.
One of the things we've seen, though, is all kinds of civic journalism experiments. They're all tried to go cover what is working, and they don't end up creating a profit. Even you guys over at AOL had to sell patch covering local news because it just doesn't work.
But actually, for us, our coverage of what is working has been one of the most profitable initiatives. Our public, our readers love it, advertisers love it, but most important, it's really critical when you have a more and more dysfunctional government to focus on what individuals, communities, startups are doing that is actually working, and to help scale it. I mean, it's essential right now, and he could help do that.
So, Cory, throw us ahead 5 years. What does the Washington Post look like based on what you know about Jeff Bezos?
Well, and to throw back to your earlier premise about what has, that only sort of taking a side has worked online. In fact, if you expand the conversation wider, if you look at what's worked in sports, for example, if you look at what's worked in celebrity coverage, there are passionate sites that cover culture, that cover sports, that haven't had to take a left or right view, that aren't just old media in a new world. I think what you can expect from Bezos is investment, because the way they're investing in Amazon is just incredible. They've spent more money in the last 6 months investing than they've spent in any year in their history. They're spending like crazy to build up and invest, but also experimentation. I think that you would expect him as an owner to really push hard to find new ways to develop media that's appropriate for this new technological age that maybe the Graham family just couldn't figure out or wasn't. Don Graham sits on the board of Facebook. He is not a rube when it comes to technology.
He didn't invest enough in Facebook. 10 seconds left, George Will.
Amazon has been hard on bookstores, not hard on books. People are still reading a lot. I'm in 400 newspapers. I have no idea how many people read my column in the paper or on the web. I'd like to find out, and maybe Mr. Bezos will tell me.
Probably can track it somewhere. It was a great discussion, everyone. Thank you all very much.